Welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very interesting episode of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales 101. So while we're waiting for the next major news update to be provided for this game, I thought it would be relatively fun and pretty informative if we were to actually fully recap all of the primary narrative elements that did occur for Miles Morales' character leading up from Spider-Man PS4 going into his own game. Now obviously there is quite a lot of ground to cover for the overall story that does relate to Spider-Man PS4, but in this instance we're mainly going to cover exactly what happens to Miles' character throughout this game's narrative. Not to mention that we also have a brief synopsis from Insomniac games themselves describing exactly what the general plot will be for Miles Morales PS5. So seeing that we essentially have a general grasp on the main plot of Miles Morales' own game, as well as the main narrative that did occur within Spider-Man PS4 and the City That Never Sleeps DLC, I definitely think that this will be a great way to get you up to speed within the Marvel Spider-Man universe and to fully prepare yourself before you start playing Miles Morales PS5. And without further ado, let's start at the beginning of Miles' story. Within the universe of Spider-Man PS4, Miles Morales was born directly in the heart of New York City's Brooklyn, and is the only son of police officer Jefferson Davis and teacher Rio Morales. As a kid, Miles displayed a very high amount of intelligence as well as a natural aptitude for science and technology. Even when growing up, Miles developed an inclination for technology at an early age, taking apart his family's TV at the age of 5. Even while attending Midtown High, it's revealed that Miles is actually a bit of a nerd who goes to robotics club at school and knows his way around technology. Furthermore, at Miles' age within Spider-Man PS4's story of 15 years old, he's already fully developed an app that allows him to hack into nearby devices, including military-grade equipment, and cause distractions, making him a remarkably skilled hacker, like what we saw with Silver Sable International. This is also, of course, with the assistance of his friend Gank, who we may or may not see as a supporting character within Miles Morales PS5. But alongside all of this, Miles still holds an extremely outgoing personality who's always trying to do the right thing, much like his own personal hero with that of the Amazing Spider-Man. Even more so with his father, Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis himself is also an extremely upstanding police officer willing to lay his life on the line in service of others, which was directly shown when Jefferson actually managed to save Spidey's life before he got smashed by an inner demon truck, which in turn awarded him with the New York City Department Medal of Honor, bestowed upon him directly by Mayor Osborn himself at City Hall. And sadly, the events that followed directly at City Hall were just beyond tragic. Due to Martin Lee's hateful vendetta against Norman Osborn, this then caused Mr. Negative to use his mind-altering powers on innocent bystanders to try and set up suicide bombers to try and take out Norman Osborn in the process. And while Norman himself was able to escape the premises before the destruction occurred, the explosions caused by the bombs and the rampaging of the inner demons did manage to take quite a few innocent bystanders' lives, including that of Jefferson Davis. And because of this extremely traumatic experience, as well as the rapid exposure to his late father's passing, Miles is understandably having trouble dealing with this amount of loss, which also causes a significant amount of mourning between Miles, Rio, and even Miles' uncle, Aaron Davis, who we all know as the Prowler, who may or may not be a main villain within Miles Morales' game. But luckily, Miles doesn't have to deal with this loss alone, and this is where he's first introduced to Peter Parker. Miles initially meets Peter at Jefferson's funeral, where a mourning Miles is dismissive of Peter's efforts to console him. But in time, the two eventually become very good friends. However, this is only after Peter manages to convince Miles to join him at volunteering at Feast. Since both Peter and Miles have lost their respective father figures, like that of Uncle Ben and Jefferson Davis, the two bond relatively quickly, with Miles coming to treat Peter as an older brother and a mentor figure. And this thoroughly connective bond that Peter and Miles share with each other was even further displayed when Peter actually saved Miles as Spider-Man. As Peter soon came to find out, Miles has been a long idolizing fan of Peter's alter ego Spider-Man for quite some time, inspired by his acts of heroism. Miles actually went on to go and meet our friendly neighborhood wall crawler for the very first time in person through a chance encounter, when Spidey saves him from a beatdown at the hands of a group of thugs. All the while Miles was simply trying to make his way to the Feast shelter. And briefly after these heroic deeds ensue, Spider-Man then teaches a starstruck Miles some tips on fighting, which later helps him defend himself against some Rikers Island escapees. And of course, these lessons will most likely help Miles further in the future once he starts to fully become his own Spider-Man within Miles Morales PS5. Now, moving on a bit further within the overall narrative of Spider-Man PS4, transitioning into the third act of the game's story, Miles is now fully working at the Fee Shelter when prisoners escape from Riker's Island and the raft, as Miles is actually continuing to help Aunt May with those sick from the Devil's Breath exposure, caused by that of Dr. Octopus. And because of the rapid spreading of the Devil's Breath sickness, it then causes Miles to go out on a supply run to try and pick up more medicine for those in need at the Fee Shelter, where he then encounters some of the most frightening foes that one could imagine without superpowers to deal with that of Rhino and Scorpion. And after successfully swiping the amoxicillin antibiotics that Miles needs for the Fee Shelter, he then manages to actually escape the apprehension of Rhino in full force. Although I'm still personally hoping that we receive a rematch with Rhino one way or another within Miles Morales' game. However, Miles won't actually end up having to feel all that powerless for too long, considering that a little bit later within the game's story, Miles is then bitten by a genetically enhanced spider which was held captive within a secret laboratory held directly in Norman Osborn's penthouse. And after the spider went on to find its way from Mary Jane directly onto Miles' hand, it then bestowed upon him similar powers to that of Peter, as well as the added abilities of electrokinesis and invisibility, which we obviously see on full display within Miles Morales PS5 with the use of his Venom Blast and camouflage. And the main reason why these spiders exist in the first place is because Norman wants to find out more as to exactly how Spider-Man obtained his powers, which on the flip side might potentially manufacture a method as to how to cure Harry Osborn, who in fact is suffering the same exact disease that Norman's wife was suffering from before she died. Although I do think it's safe to say that Harry's narrative will be saved for the official sequel of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 later on. But still, there is a possibility that we could see a slight tease of Harry potentially becoming that of Venom within the end of Miles Morales' game. But moving back to Miles, after he started coping with his newfound powers, he then decided to reveal his true nature to Peter Parker by the end of Spider-Man PS4's story, where then Peter himself immediately revealed his own true nature to Miles as well, showcasing the birth of a brand new Spider-Man. This now leads us to probably the most important development of Miles' character, which surprisingly happens directly off-screen during the City That Never Sleeps DLC. Now, throughout all 3 chapters of this DLC pack, with that of the heist, turf wars, and silver lining, Miles continuously calls Peter asking about getting some training for his powers. While Peter is initially unwilling to let Miles jeopardize his life by following in his footsteps, Miles admits that he accidentally used his powers to show off in basketball. Promising not to do it again as long as Peter trains him, Miles manages to convince Peter to consider it. And during the Magia gang wars in the Turf Wars DLC chapter, it's revealed that Peter has indeed begun giving Miles training lessons in his powers. Bolstered by the newfound knowledge he's learning, Miles contacts Peter about doing hero work. His questions are gently shot down by Peter, who warns him about the responsibility associated with his powers. And shortly after not heeding Peter's warning, Miles then goes and jumps off a bridge in New York City, which then breaks his toe in the process. Peter then reiterates his previous statement about being responsible, and Miles promises to do better. And by the end of the Silver Lining DLC, Peter then agrees to meet Miles that weekend for another lesson of in-field training. And as we see by the very end of that DLC, Miles then begins to finally take his first swing into becoming his own Spider-Man. And for me personally, just knowing that the very final scene of Silver Lining was directly teasing Miles Morales PS5 from the get-go is just an incredible thing to see play out now with this full trailer. And speaking of which, that directly leads us into what we know now revolving around Miles Morales PS5's story, or at least the basic concept as to what we can expect going forward. Coming directly from the game's creative director himself, Brian Horton, he went on to state that we knew that Miles' origin story as a Spider-Man was something that needed its own game. Miles' multicultural background reflects a more modern, diverse world, and we wanted to give players a new story with new set pieces, fresh villains, and unique quests across Marvel's New York City to experience. This had to be a can't-miss next adventure in the Marvel's Spider-Man universe. And because of that, the setting itself is going to be a bit different from what the original game was in the first place. Within Miles Morales PS5, it's now wintertime about a year after the events of the first game, where Marvel's New York City is now fully covered in snow, and just before Christmas break, a war between an energy corporation and a high-tech criminal army has broken out. As for Miles, he's now currently residing in his brand new home in Harlem, within the heart of the battle. Now obviously, while we don't fully know who the primary antagonist of Miles Morales PS5 is, whether or not that be someone like the Prowler, or maybe the return of Mr. Negative himself. I just fully know that based on everything that we did receive with Miles' character in Spider-Man PS4, and seeing how unique they're going to expand that narrative within Miles Morales' game, it's truly going to be a story that I can't wait to dive into once the game fully releases. And while I'm still extremely excited to see exactly what the main gameplay is going to look like for Miles Morales PS5, if we do manage to receive a story trailer of some kind down the line, I will also see that as a massive win. But until that time comes, everyone, that's the video I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comments section down below. What do you think about the narrative that did occur within Spider-Man PS4 and everything that we do currently know now for Miles Morales PS5? It's truly going to be a pretty impactful experience to see Miles fully individualize himself as he grows into his own Spider-Man within this game. And just knowing how well handled Peter's character was within Spider-Man PS4, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that Insomniac will do Miles' character justice within his standalone game. But until next time, everyone, thank you all so much for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans, and peace out.
Miles? Hey, I've been trying to reach you. You okay?
Hey, so, don't freak out, but, I gotta fill you in on some stuff.